Charleston, South Carolina, October 15, 1847. The morning air hung thick with humidity and the stench of human misery. The Ryan's slave mart buzzed with its usual crowd of wealthy plantation owners, their gold pocket watches glinting in the harsh sunlight as they examined human beings like livestock. But something was different this morning, something that made even the most callous slave traders shift uncomfortably in their boots. Her name was Seraphina. Though the auction records would only list her as female, age approximately 25, strong constitution, she stood on the auction block with a dignity that seemed impossible given her circumstances. Her dark skin bore the telltale scars of plantation life, but her eyes, something that made grown men look away. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Pritchard, had been in this business for 20 years. He'd sold thousands of human beings, each transaction as routine as selling cattle. But as he looked at Seraphina, his practiced sales pitch died in his throat. "Now, gentlemen," Pritchard began, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm, "we have here a fine specimen, strong back, good teeth, suitable for field work or household duties." The crowd, usually eager and vocal during bidding, remained eerily quiet. Plantation owners who had traveled hundreds of miles to acquire new labor suddenly found their attention diverted to their shoes, their pocket watches, anywhere but the woman on the block. But why? What was it about Seraphina that made these hardened men of commerce suddenly lose their appetite for human trafficking? Keep watching, because the answer lies in a series of events that began 3 plantations and 5 dead overseers ago. To understand why no one would bid on Seraphina, we need to go back 18 months to the Magnolia Grove plantation in Georgia. It was there that Seraphina first gained her reputation, though reputation is far too gentle a word for what the plantation owners whispered about in their private clubs. Overseer Thomas McKinnon was found dead on a Tuesday morning in March 1846. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the slaves who found his body told a different story. McKinnon, a man who took pleasure in the suffering of others, was discovered in the slave quarters with his eyes wide open in terror, his body twisted in an unnatural position, and strange symbols carved into the dirt around him. The plantation owner, Colonel William Ashford, initially dismissed the slaves' whispered tales of conjure and curses. McKinnon was replaced with an even crueler overseer, James Rutledge, who boasted that no superstitious nonsense would interfere with his management style. Rutledge lasted exactly 6 weeks. He was found floating face down in the plantation's well, though he couldn't swim and the well was surrounded by a 4-foot stone wall. The water, when tested, was found to be bitter and undrinkable for weeks afterward. But most disturbing were the reports from other slaves that Rutledge had been seen walking the plantation grounds for 3 nights after his death, his waterlogged form calling out warnings about the woman who speaks to the dead. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like folklore, like the kind of stories that grow in the telling. But here's where it gets really interesting and really documented, because by 1847, insurance companies in Charleston were keeping records of these incidents, and the pattern they discovered was undeniable. Comment below if you've ever heard similar stories from your own family history. You might be surprised how many of these tales have been passed down through generations. After the Magnolia Grove incidents, Seraphina was sold to the Riverside Plantation in South Carolina. The new owner, Benjamin Crowley, was a practical man who didn't believe in Negro superstitions. He paid a premium for Seraphina, confident that her reputation would make her a compliant worker. He couldn't have been more wrong. Within a month of her arrival, strange things began happening at Riverside. Crops that had flourished for decades began to wither in perfect circles around areas where Seraphina had work. Livestock died without explanation, always in groups of 3, always positioned to form triangular patterns in the fields. But it was the death of Overseer Samuel Henley that truly established Seraphina's fearsome reputation throughout the Carolina Low Country. Henley was a religious man, or so he claimed. He carried a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other, justifying his cruelty with twisted scripture. He took particular interest in breaking Seraphina, seeing her quiet dignity as a personal challenge to his authority. The other slaves later testified that Seraphina had warned Henley 3 times. She had spoken to him directly, something that would normally result in severe punishment. But each warning was delivered with such calm certainty that even Henley hesitated to raise his hand against her. "Your cruelty will return to you threefold," she had said after he whipped an elderly man for working too slowly. "The pain you cause will find its way back to your door." she warned after he separated a mother from her young children. Death walks behind those who trade in death, she told him the night before he was found. Samuel Henley's death was unlike anything the local authorities had ever investigated, and what they found in that plantation house would become the stuff of legend. But before I tell you exactly what happened to Henley, let me ask you this: are you starting to see why no one wanted to bid on Seraphina? Like this video if you're beginning to understand, and keep watching because the worst is yet to come. On the morning of September 12, 1846, Samuel Henley was found in his study by his own wife. The room was locked from the inside, the windows were barred, and there was no other way in or out. But Henley was not alone in that room. Arranged around his desk were the bodies of every animal he had killed on the plantation over the past month: cats, dogs, even a horse that had somehow been dragged up 2 flights of stairs. Each animal showed signs of the exact torture that Henley had inflicted upon them before their deaths. Henley himself was found seated at his desk, his Bible open to Exodus 21:24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. His body bore the marks of every punishment he had ever delivered to the slaves under his care. Every scar, every burn, every broken bone, all replicated with surgical precision on his own flesh. But he was still alive. For 3 days, Samuel Henley lingered between life and death, conscious but unable to speak, his eyes following something invisible that moved around his room. The local doctor, a man named Theodore Whitman, documented everything in his medical journal, a journal that still exists in the Charleston Historical Society archives. Dr. Whitman wrote, "The patient presents with injuries that mirror exactly the punishments he has administered to others. Most disturbing is his apparent awareness of an unseen presence in the room. He tracks movement with his eyes, occasionally mouthing the word mercy to empty air. The wounds, while severe, do not follow any natural progression. They appear and deepen according to no medical logic I can comprehend." On the 3rd day, Henley finally died. His last words, according to Dr. Whitman, were, "She speaks for all of them." All of them. Now, includes detailed sketches of Henley's wounds, and I have to tell you, looking at those images is deeply disturbing. But they also provide crucial evidence for what happened next. Because Benjamin Crowley, despite witnessing these events firsthand, made a decision that would seal his own fate. Hit the like button if you think you know what Crowley did next, and comment your guess below. You might think that after witnessing Samuel Henley's supernatural demise, Benjamin Crowley would have immediately freed Seraphina, or at least treated her with respect. But greed and pride are powerful motivators, and Crowley was convinced he could succeed where others had failed. Instead of acknowledging the pattern of death that followed Seraphina, Crowley decided to sell her quickly and quietly. He contacted the Charleston slave market, describing her only as a field hand of good constitution, suitable for hard labor. What he didn't mention was the growing list of deaths that seemed to follow in her wake. But word travels fast in the tight-knit community of plantation owners, and by the time Seraphina arrived at the Charleston market, her reputation had preceded her. The experienced traders took one look at the manifest, noting her previous owners and the suspicious deaths at their plantations, and immediately understood what they were dealing with. This is why the crowd fell silent when she took the auction block. This is why men who had traveled hundreds of miles to buy slaves suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. They had heard the stories. They had seen the insurance reports. They knew that purchasing Seraphina wasn't just buying a slave, it was inviting death itself onto their property. All except one man. The man who eventually bid on Seraphina was someone who should have known better than anyone to stay away. His identity and his motives would shock everyone present that day. And what happened after he won the auction would become the most documented supernatural event in antebellum Charleston history. Stay with me, because we're about to meet the man who thought he could control the uncontrollable. As the auctioneer's voice grew more desperate, calling for any bid at all, a figure emerged from the back of the crowd. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His name was Cornelius Blackwood, and he was not just any plantation owner. Blackwood was what locals called a breaker, a man who specialized in purchasing difficult slaves and breaking their spirit through methods so cruel that other plantation owners whispered about them in hushed tones. But Blackwood's reputation went beyond mere cruelty. He was rumored to dabble in the occult, to study African spiritual practices not out of respect, but to better understand how to corrupt and destroy them. His plantation, Shadowmere, was said to be a place where traditional conjure went to die, where Blackwood had developed techniques to turn spiritual power against itself. "I'll take her," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent marketplace. $100. The auctioneer, clearly relieved to have any bid at all, quickly accepted. But as Blackwood stepped forward to claim his purchase, something extraordinary happened. Seraphina spoke. She had remained silent throughout the entire auction process, maintaining the dignity that had so unnerved the crowd. But as Blackwood approached, she looked directly at him and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the marketplace, "You think you understand the old ways, but you understand nothing. You collect power like coins, not knowing that some debts can never be paid. The spirits you mock will have their justice, and I will be their instrument." The crowd, already on edge, began to murmur and shift. Several men crossed themselves, others simply walked away, no longer willing to witness what they sensed was about to unfold. But Cornelius Blackwood merely smiled. What happened next was witnessed by over 50 people, many of whom gave sworn statements to local authorities. If you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden history, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because stories like this are exactly what Buried TRHS is all about, the tales they tried to erase from the history books. The journey from Charleston to Blackwood's Shadowmere plantation should have taken 2 days by wagon. It took 6. On the first day, Blackwood's horses, animals known for their reliability and calm temperament, began to show signs of extreme distress whenever they came within a certain distance of Seraphina. They would rear, foam at the mouth, and refuse to continue until she was moved to a different position in the wagon. On the second day, the wagon wheels began breaking with unusual frequency. Each time they stopped for repairs, local blacksmiths would examine the wheels and find stress fractures that seemed to have appeared from the inside out, as if the metal itself had been twisted by some internal force. By the third day, Blackwood's own slaves, men who had been broken by his methods and reduced to complete obedience, began to show signs of rebellion. They whispered among themselves in languages Blackwood didn't recognize, and he noticed that they avoided looking directly at Seraphina while simultaneously seeming to draw strength from her presence. But it was on the 4th night that Blackwood began to understand what he had purchased. They had made camp beside a small creek, and Blackwood had chained Seraphina to a sturdy oak tree. Confident that his restraints would hold her, he posted guards and settled into his tent, already planning the methods he would use to break her spirit once they reached Shadowmere. He was awakened by singing. The voice was Seraphina's, but the song was unlike anything Blackwood had ever heard. It was a melody that seemed to reach into the earth itself, calling to things that had been sleeping in the soil for centuries. As the song continued, the very air around the camp began to change. First came the animals. Creatures that should have been afraid of humans, wolves, bears, even a massive alligator from the nearby swampland, emerged from the darkness and arranged themselves in a perfect circle around Seraphina. They showed no aggression toward the humans, but their presence was clearly protective. Then came something else. What Cornelius Blackwood saw that night would be documented in his own personal journal, pages that weren't discovered until after his death. And what he wrote there would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the spiritual practices of enslaved Africans. But I have to warn you, what comes next is not for the faint of heart. According to Blackwood's journal, as Seraphina's song continued, the air itself began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was October and the night was cold. Within those shimmers, shapes began to form. Human figures, translucent but unmistakably real, emerged from what seemed to be the very fabric of the night. Men, women, and children, all bearing the marks of bondage, scars from whips, brands from irons, the unmistakable posture of people who had lived and died in chains. But these spirits showed no signs of the brokenness that had defined their earthly lives. They stood tall, proud, and filled with a power that made the air around them crackle with energy. Blackwood, despite his reputation for cruelty and his dabbling in the occult, found himself paralyzed with terror. He recognized some of the faces, slaves who had died on various plantations throughout the region, many by his own hand or at his direction. The spirits didn't approach him directly. Instead, they turned their attention to Seraphina, and what happened next defied every natural law Blackwood thought he understood. The chains that bound her simply dissolved, not broke, not fell away, but dissolved like sugar in water, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. Seraphina rose to her feet, and as she did, The spirits bowed to her in a gesture of profound respect. She was not just a woman who had suffered under slavery. She was something more, a keeper of traditions, a conduit for ancestral power, a living bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In his journal, Blackwood wrote, "I understood then that I had not purchased a slave. I had invited judgment itself onto my property. The woman standing before me was not bound by earthly chains because she served a higher authority, the collective will of all who had died in bondage, seeking justice for crimes that would never see a courtroom." But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Blackwood didn't just witness these events, he documented them with the precision of a man trying to understand a phenomenon that challenged his entire worldview. And what he discovered about Seraphina's true identity would explain everything that had happened on those previous plantations. Drop a comment if you're starting to piece together who Seraphina really was. As dawn approached and the spirits began to fade back into the ether, Seraphina approached Blackwood's tent. He expected her to strike him down, to call upon the supernatural forces she clearly commanded to exact immediate vengeance. Instead, she did something far more terrifying. She told him the truth. "My name is Seraphina Ashanti," she said, using a surname that made Blackwood's blood run cold. The Ashanti people of West Africa were known for their sophisticated spiritual traditions, their warrior culture, and their absolute refusal to accept subjugation. "I am the daughter of Nana Ya Asantewa, warrior queen of the Ashanti Empire. I was captured not in a slave raid, but in the final battle of our resistance against British colonization. I was sold not because I was weak, but because keeping me in Africa would have made me a rallying point for continued rebellion." This revelation explained everything. Seraphina was not just spiritually powerful, she was royalty, trained from birth in the mystical traditions of one of Africa's most formidable kingdoms. She had been deliberately separated from her people not to break her, but because her very presence inspired resistance. "But here, in this land of cotton and chains," she continued, "I found something my captors never expected. I found the spirits of my people, not just Ashanti but Yoruba, Igbo, Mandinka, all the nations torn from their homes and brought here in chains. They were waiting, Mr. Blackwood. Waiting for someone who could speak their language, someone who could channel their collective rage into focused action." Blackwood, still paralyzed with fear, managed to ask the question that had been haunting him. "What do you want?" Seraphina's answer was simple and absolutely terrifying. "Justice. For every lash of the whip, for every child sold away from their mother, for every man worked to death in these fields. The dead demand payment for these crimes, Mr. Blackwood. And you are going to help me collect it." What Seraphina proposed next would turn Cornelius Blackwood from slave owner into something unprecedented in American history. And the methods she used to accomplish this transformation would be so effective that they would eventually inspire a movement that contributed to the end of slavery itself. You won't believe what happens next. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary psychological and spiritual transformation in recorded American history. Rather than destroying Blackwood immediately, Seraphina offered him a choice, and the terms of that choice would redefine everything he thought he knew about power, justice, and redemption. "You have three options," she told him as they sat beside the dying campfire. "First, I can call upon the spirits to exact immediate justice for your crimes. Your death would be swift but educational for those who found your body. Second, you can continue to shadowmare and attempt to use your methods to break me. I warn you, many have tried. You have seen the results. Third, you can choose to become something different, something unprecedented. You can use your wealth, your connections, and your knowledge of the plantation system to serve justice instead of perpetuating injustice." A Blackwood, still struggling to comprehend what he had witnessed, asked what the third option would actually entail. Seraphina's answer would change the course of both their lives. "You will become a conductor on a railroad that doesn't yet exist. You will use Shadowmare not as a plantation, but as a station for escaped slaves making their way to freedom. You will take the methods you developed to break spirits and reverse them, using your understanding of psychological manipulation to heal trauma instead of causing it." But there was more. Seraphina explained that his transformation would not be voluntary in the traditional sense. She would use her spiritual abilities to ensure his compliance, creating what she called a binding of conscience, a supernatural compulsion that would make it impossible for him to return to his old ways. "You will retain your free will in all matters except those that involve the suffering of others," she explained. Any attempt to cause harm, to profit from bondage, or to betray the trust of those seeking freedom will result in immediate and severe consequences. To demonstrate the binding, she asked him to attempt to strike her. Blackwood raised his hand, but found that his muscles simply would not obey. The harder he tried to complete the action, the more intense the pain became, until he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. "This binding will remain until the day you die," Seraphina continued, "but in exchange, you will experience something you have never known, the satisfaction of using your power to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. Now, I know this sounds impossible, like something out of a fantasy novel rather than documented history. But remember, we have Blackwood's own journal entries describing these events, and what happened at Shadowmere over the next 15 years was witnessed by hundreds of people. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history, make sure you hit that subscribe button." The Shadowmere plantation that Seraphina and Blackwood arrived at was a monument to human cruelty. The slave quarters were deliberately designed to be as uncomfortable as possible. The work schedules were brutal even by plantation standards, and the punishment systems that Blackwood had developed were legendary for their psychological sophistication. But within 6 months, Shadowmere had become something unprecedented in the antebellum South, a plantation that operated as a front for the Underground Railroad while simultaneously serving as a healing center for escaped slaves. The transformation began with the slaves already at Shadowmere. Under Seraphina's guidance and using Blackwood's forced cooperation, the plantation became a place where the psychological damage of slavery was systematically reversed. The same techniques that Blackwood had used to break spirits were modified and used to rebuild them. Slaves who arrived at Shadowmere broken and traumatized left as confident, educated individuals prepared to build new lives in freedom. But the process was not simply therapeutic, it was deeply spiritual. Drawing on the African traditions that Seraphina represented and the ancestral connections she could facilitate, word of Shadowmere's transformation spread through the Underground Railroad network, but in a way that protected its secret. To the outside world, Blackwood remained a successful plantation owner whose slaves seemed unusually content and productive. But to those in the know, Shadowmere became known as the healing place, a station where souls could be mended before continuing their journey to freedom. Blackwood, bound by Seraphina's spiritual compulsion, found himself experiencing emotions he had never felt before: the satisfaction of helping rather than harming, the joy of seeing broken people become whole, the profound sense of purpose that came from serving justice rather than perpetuating injustice. In his journal, he wrote, "I do not understand the forces that have transformed me, but I cannot deny their effect. Where once I took pleasure in the suffering of others, I now find my greatest satisfaction in alleviating that suffering. The binding she placed upon me has not diminished my intelligence or my capabilities. It has simply redirected them toward constructive, rather than destructive ends." But the most incredible part of this story is what happened when word of Shadowmere's transformation reached other plantation owners. Because Seraphina's influence didn't stop with Blackwood, she was building something much larger, much more dangerous to the slavery itself. By 1850, rumors about Shadowmere had reached plantation owners throughout South Carolina and Georgia. The official story was that Cornelius Blackwood had developed new methods for managing slaves that resulted in higher productivity and fewer escapes. Plantation owners who had known Blackwood's reputation for cruelty were intrigued by his apparent success with more humane methods. What they didn't realize was that they were walking into Seraphina's expanding web of influence. Plantation owners who visited Shadowmere came expecting to learn new techniques for controlling their human property. Instead, they encountered something they were completely unprepared for: direct spiritual intervention that challenged their ability to continue participating in the slave system. Seraphina had developed what she called the awakening process. Using her connections to ancestral spirits and her deep understanding of African spiritual traditions, she could force plantation owners to experience slavery from the perspective of the enslaved. The process began subtly. Visitors to Shadowmere would find themselves having unusually vivid dreams about being chained, sold, separated from family members. They would wake with phantom pains from whips they had never felt, with emotional anguish for children they had never lost. As the spiritual pressure intensified, these men found themselves unable to raise their hands against their slaves, unable to separate families, unable to engage in the casual cruelties that had defined their relationship with their human property. Some fought against the influence, but fighting only made it stronger. Others, like Blackwood, eventually surrendered to the transformation and found their plantations becoming additional stations on an underground railroad network that was far more sophisticated and spiritually protected than historians have ever realized. By 1855, Seraphina's influence had spread to more than 20 plantations across 3 states. Each transformed plantation became a beacon of hope for enslaved people throughout the region, and a source of growing concern for authorities who couldn't quite understand why so many slaves seemed to be disappearing from certain properties. But Seraphina's ultimate goal was much more ambitious than simply transforming individual plantations. She was building towards something that would strike at the very heart of the slavery system. And when that plan finally came to fruition, it would contribute to events that helped bring about the Civil War itself. By 1858, Seraphina's network had grown beyond what anyone could have imagined. The transformed plantations were not just hiding escaped slaves, they were actively recruiting them from other properties, providing them with education and resources, and helping them establish new lives in the North. But more importantly, they were serving as centers for something that terrified Southern authorities more than any slave rebellion: the systematic spiritual awakening of enslaved people throughout the region. Through her network of transformed plantation owners and the spiritual connections she maintained with ancestral forces, Seraphina was able to reach enslaved people on plantations far from her direct influence. They began experiencing dreams and visions that connected them to their African heritage, that reminded them of their inherent dignity and power, that prepared them for the coming change. The psychological impact was enormous. Enslaved people who had been broken by the system began to remember who they were before slavery had tried to define them. They began to organize, to resist, to plan for freedom with a coordination and spiritual unity that made traditional methods of control increasingly ineffective. Southern authorities noticed the change but couldn't identify its source. Plantation owners reported increasing insubordination among their slaves, but the resistance was too coordinated, too spiritually sophisticated to be addressed through traditional punishment methods. It was in this context that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry occurred in 1859. While Brown's actions were planned and executed independently of Seraphina's network, the spiritual groundwork she had laid throughout the region meant that enslaved people were psychologically and organizationally prepared to respond to his call for armed resistance. The failure of Brown's raid didn't diminish the impact of Seraphina's work, it accelerated it. The approaching Civil War was sensed by the ancestral spirits she channeled, and through her, enslaved people throughout the South began preparing for the liberation they knew was coming. But what happened to Seraphina herself as the Civil War approached would prove that her story was far from over. In fact, her final transformation would make everything that came before seem like mere preparation for her ultimate purpose. When the Civil War began in 1861, Seraphina was no longer the same woman who had stood on that auction block in Charleston 14 years earlier. She had become something unprecedented, a spiritual leader whose influence extended across multiple states, whose network of transformed plantations had become an integral part of the Underground Railroad, and whose connection to ancestral forces had helped prepare thousands of enslaved people for the liberation that was finally at hand. But Seraphina understood that the war itself was not enough. Military victory would end the legal institution of slavery, but it would not address the deeper spiritual and psychological wounds that centuries of bondage had inflicted on both the enslaved and their oppressors. Working with Cornelius Blackwood and the other transformed plantation owners in her network, Seraphina began developing what she called the Great Healing, a process designed to help both former slaves and former slave owners navigate the psychological transition from bondage to freedom. The transformed plantations became centers for this healing work. Former slaves received not just material support, but spiritual counseling that helped them reclaim their sense of identity and purpose. Meanwhile, former slave owners who had been touched by Seraphina's influence found themselves compelled to make amends for their participation in the slavery system. Blackwood himself became a model for this process. Using his wealth and connections, he established schools for freed slaves, funded legal challenges to discriminatory laws, and worked tirelessly to create economic opportunities for people transitioning out of bondage. But perhaps most importantly, he documented everything. His journals from this period provide an unprecedented first-hand account of what it was like to be spiritually transformed from oppressor to ally, and his writings would later influence Reconstruction policies throughout the South. As Union forces advanced through South Carolina in 1865, they found something they hadn't expected: plantations where former slaves and former owners were working together to build a new kind of society, one based on principles of justice and mutual respect rather than domination and exploitation. The story of what happened when Union soldiers actually encountered these transformed plantations is almost too incredible to believe. And what Seraphina told them about the future of race relations in America would prove to be prophetic in ways that are still relevant today. When Union forces finally reached Shadowmere in February 1865, they expected to find a typical plantation, perhaps one where the slaves had already fled, or where the owner was preparing to make a last stand against federal authority. Instead, they found something that challenged every assumption they had about the South, about slavery, and about the possibilities for racial reconciliation in America. The plantation was operating as a thriving integrated community. Former slaves and former owners were working together as equals, sharing resources and decision-making responsibilities. Children who had been born into slavery were attending schools alongside the children of former overseers. Former house slaves were serving as teachers and administrators, while former plantation owners worked as laborers and craftsmen. The Union officers who documented their visit to Shadowmere struggled to describe what they were seeing. Captain William Harrison wrote in his report, "I have served in this war for 4 years, and I thought I understood what we were fighting for. But what I found at Shadowmere suggests possibilities for post-war reconstruction that go far beyond anything our political leaders have imagined." Seraphina, now in her 40s but possessing a dignity and presence that made her seem ageless, served as the unofficial leader of the community. When the Union officers asked her how she had accomplished this transformation, her answer provided a blueprint for healing that America is still struggling to implement. "Healing begins with truth," she told them. "Not the comfortable lies that people tell themselves to justify their actions, but the deep truths about how systems of oppression damage both the oppressed and the oppressor. Everyone who participated in slavery, as slave, as owner, as overseer, as trader, carries wounds that must be acknowledged before they can be healed." She explained that the spiritual practices she had used were not magic in the supernatural sense, but rather applications of psychological and social principles that her African heritage had preserved and refined over centuries of dealing with conflict and trauma. "The ancestors who guide me are not ghosts," she said. "They are the accumulated wisdom of people who faced impossible circumstances and found ways not just to survive, but to transform those circumstances into opportunities for growth and healing." But here's the most incredible part of Seraphina's story. What she accomplished at Shadowmere was just the beginning. Her methods for healing the psychological wounds of slavery would influence Reconstruction policies, inspire civil rights leaders, and provide a blueprint for racial reconciliation that is still being studied today. And the final chapter of her story, what happened when she was finally truly free to choose her own path, will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the possibilities for human transformation. After the war ended, Seraphina had choices that she had never possessed before. She could have used her influence to build personal wealth and power. She could have sought revenge against those who had participated in the slavery system. She could have simply disappeared, using her spiritual abilities to create a comfortable life far from the memories of bondage. Instead, she chose to continue the work of healing. Working with Cornelius Blackwood and others in her network, Seraphina established what became known as the Shadowmere model, integrated communities throughout the South where former slaves and former owners worked together to build new forms of social organization based on principles of justice and mutual respect. These communities became centers of education, economic development, and political organization that played crucial roles in the early years of Reconstruction. They served as proof that racial integration was not only possible, but could be mutually beneficial when approached with the right spiritual and psychological frameworks. But Seraphina's influence extended far beyond the South. Her methods for healing trauma and transforming oppressive relationships were studied and adapted by social reformers throughout the country. Her emphasis on addressing the psychological roots of racism rather than just its legal manifestations would later influence leaders like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and eventually Martin Luther King Jr., Most importantly, Seraphina demonstrated that true liberation requires more than just the absence of chains. It requires the active healing of the wounds that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike. In 1885, at the age of 63, Seraphina finally retired from active leadership of the communities she had helped establish. She spent her final years documenting the spiritual and psychological techniques she had developed, creating a body of knowledge that would influence healing practitioners for generations to come. She died peacefully in 1892, surrounded by people of all races who had been transformed by her work. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of former slaves who credited her with their freedom, former slave owners who credited her with their redemption, and community leaders who credited her with showing them a path toward true racial reconciliation.